Several significant things pertaining to fascism happened in 1936. Hitler's Germany reoccupied the Rhineland. That is to say, military troops went in. Now, they'd already, as stated before, they had been building tanks and artillery and all the things that they weren't supposed to have, and had vastly grown their military. So they violated the Treaty of Versailles by sending troops into the Rhineland, but there was no one there to oppose them, and no one really did anything about it. That same year, Italy invaded Ethiopia in the northern part of Africa. Ethiopia was one of only 2 or 3 independent African countries, and it had gained its independence in the previous century. That independence had been and sovereignty had been recognized by Italy in 1889, but then later on, a few years after that, in the 1890s, Italy had tried to invade Ethiopia and conquer it, and had been defeated and pushed out. Well, here we are in 1936, and Mussolini, Il Duce, wants to restore the nation's honor and sort of undo that defeat so as to, redress the balance and make Italy great again, essentially. And the Ethiopian leader, Haile Selassie, spoke out worldwide about this invasion, trying to get help, and he got a lot of attention, he got a lot of sympathy, and he became Time magazine's Man of the Year, but no one really helped, and Italy did in fact conquer Ethiopia. All right, over in Spain. In Spain, around 1930, the military dictatorship that had been in charge there was overthrown, and a republic was set up, the Republic of Spain, a democracy. Over the next several years, the government sort of went back and forth between the left and the right, trying to gain primacy in Parliament, essentially. And in 1936, the left called the Popular Front, which was a coalition of several different leftist groups, including socialist and communist groups, outperformed the other end, the nationalist coalition, in the election, and got about 2-to-1 seats, therefore dominating the government. So 1936, the government of Spain is going to be a left of center government. Well, the people on the right, many of them, were opposed to that, and a revolution started, led by Francisco Franco, a fascist group, a nationalist group. So you've got a civil war in Spain between the official government that is on the left and the rebels who are on the far right and are ultra-nationalist fascist. Well, guess whose side Hitler was on? Obviously, the side of Franco. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, supported the Republican government of Spain, and each got indirectly involved. The Nazi government, the German government, was providing arms and ammunition and training and advisors and some limited personnel to Franco, and the Soviet Union was doing the same for the government. So the far left and far right on the global stage, Germany and the Soviet Union, were fighting a proxy war. They weren't directly fighting, but they were fighting through the two sides in the Spanish Civil War. So some people have referred to that Civil War as a dress rehearsal for World War II, and indeed it was. While Francisco Franco and the nationalists were receiving aid from the fascist governments of Germany and Italy, including air support, the Republicans, that is the Republic of Spain, were receiving some aid in the form of individual volunteers who were coming from around the world to help in the fight. Mostly, probably all people from the left to varying degrees. They came to provide military service, and they made up the International Brigade. And within the International Brigade was one entire group made up of Americans, known as the Abraham Lincoln Battalion, the Abraham Lincoln American Battalion, also sometimes called the Lincoln Brigade. It was ultimately 3,015 U.S. citizens who came to Spain to fight in the Spanish Civil War. Many of them were communist, probably, more than half. Some estimates as many as 3/4. But all of them were not, although, like I said, they all were from various shades of the left. The one thing that they had in common was that they hated fascism. This number, 3,015, included 85 African Americans. The battalion was not segregated, so it was black and white fighting together. Out of the 3,000 plus American citizens who did fight against the fascist forces of Franco, ultimately 681 died. That's about 22%, which is a really high percentage. I mentioned that there was a lot of, all of them were anti-fascist. In fact, Langston Hughes, the African-American poet that we talked about before, he said that basically all Francisco Franco needed was a hood to be a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Fighting went on for a couple of years, and ultimately the forces of Franco prevailed. The nationalists / fascists won and set up a new government, and Spain was under that very repressive fascist government for, 35 years, up until the early 1970s, I believe. Closely connected in American, really world literary culture to this is the novel that came out, I think around 1940, called For Whom the Bell Tolls, which is a novel by Ernest Hemingway, who actually had been in Spain during the fighting as a journalist. The title of the book comes from a poem from the early 1600s by the English poet John Donne. The poem is also called For Whom the Bell Tolls. It's a really short one, so I'm going to read it. No man is an island, entire of itself. Each is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thine own, or of thine friends were. Each man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind. Therefore send not to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. The tolling bell in this poem is the funeral bell. So what Donne was saying is that we are all united, we are all together, part of the human family, and that when one person suffers or when one person dies, everyone is affected by it because everyone is a part of humanity, which is the point of the novel, which is about, it follows an American named Robert Jordan, who is a Spanish professor at an American university. He's from, I don't remember where he's from in the novel, but I think Montana. Anyway, like a lot of other people in real life, this fictional character volunteered to go to Spain to fight. And in the course of that, of course, there's some romance along the way, but in the course of it, ultimately, it comes down at the end to Jordan realizing that his life, his individual life, is not as important as the cause that he is fighting for and the comrades that he has made. Well, without giving too much away, he learns the meaning of sacrifice. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria. Annex means took it over, essentially. There was a lot of support for that among the Austrian people. Not so much from the Austrian government, which was independent, but they acquiesced, and Greater Germany essentially was established with Germany and Austria together. Remember, Austria is where Hitler was born and raised. Austria had been one of those German states in the 19th century. Remember, it was all the Holy Roman Empire was broken into several little small German states that all came together and unified, and Austria had not joined in that unification. So this was also viewed as, in some ways, a reunion. However, it was another violation of the Treaty of Versailles. One of the requirements in that treaty was that Germany and Austria never unite, and here they are now, united. Well, that should keep Hitler happy for a while, you would think, but you'd be wrong. Then he sent troops into the Sudetenland and annexed that. The Sudetenland was a part of Czechoslovakia that bordered on Germany, and a large number of German people lived there. Czechoslovakia, of course, was formed as a nation at the end of World War I with that treaty. So the Czechoslovakian border had extended beyond a large number of German people living in the region. So that was the justification that Hitler had for taking this too. Well, that should be enough to satisfy him for a while, one would think, but one would be wrong, because his next goal was, heck, let's just take all of Czechoslovakia, which was a much bigger move, especially since the Czechs weren't real willing. The Czech people weren't really on board with this as much as maybe the Austrians had been, not being German. So this led to some concern around the world as other countries are thinking, hey, this guy's getting a little out of hand with his Lebensraum idea, which was room to grow, living room, that Germany was claiming that they needed. So the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain met with Hitler to try to come to some kind of agreement about his expansionism. The Prime Minister was Neville Chamberlain. And Chamberlain essentially walked away from that meeting, having made a deal with Hitler. And the deal, just to kind of briefly summarize it, the deal was, this is essentially what Chamberlain was saying to Hitler. Dear sir, please stop it. We will let you have this one more thing, that is Czechoslovakia, if you promise, pinky swear, not to take anything else. And Hitler said, of course, I promise. So there you go. Problem solved, right? One of the political rivals of Chamberlain, a guy named Winston Churchill, was not real happy with this approach. He didn't believe it was going to work. He believed it's sort of like giving more candy to a bully, which is not going to make them stop bullying. He said, quote, England has been offered a choice between war and shame. She has chosen shame and will get war. The war in question, of course, is the fact that in order to actually stop Hitler from expanding, it would have to be done physically with an army. And it's 20 years after World War I, alias the Great War. And people were still in Europe kind of traumatized in general by that, not wanting to get involved in another war. The royal family was quite pleased with this outcome. King George VI said, and this is him complaining about people who were complaining about Chamberlain, "After the magnificent efforts of the Prime Minister in the cause of peace, it is my fervent hope that a new era of friendship and prosperity may be dawning among the peoples of the world." And the Queen Mother said of Chamberlain, "He brought home peace, why can't they be grateful?" Well, they were about to find out. Spoiler alert, turns out that after this agreement, Hitler did not go home and play nice. Instead, he was emboldened to take even more, which is what bullies will do when you give in to them. The term, perhaps you've heard the term appeasement, which you may have heard of it because it's a word in the English language, but it also gets used a lot in politics, particularly international politics. Whenever someone gives in to a dictator, and by someone I mean a politician or a world leader, when they give in to a dictator, they are usually accused by their opposition as appeasers and compared to Neville Chamberlain. Nobody wants to be compared to Neville Chamberlain because this did not turn out well at all. By 1939, after all this German expansion, the Soviet Union was getting pretty concerned about Hitler and what might be coming around the corner. So they reached out. The Soviet government reached out to the governments of Great Britain and France, and suggested that they all agree to work together to stop any further German expansion. However, Britain and France at that time hated and feared the Soviet Union more than they hated and feared Germany. In fact, they were sort of the opinion, heck, let Germany take all those little places. That's fine, because that puts Germany in between us and Russia wouldn't be able to get to us without going through Germany, so that's cool, so good luck, you're on your own. At which point, the Russians then went in the other direction and reached out to Hitler and wound up signing a non-aggression pact with Germany. So essentially, this non-aggression pact was, we're not going to fight everybody that you fight, which would be an alliance, but, you do your thing and we'll do ours. They signed the pact. The pact was approved by the Soviet government. And the very next day, after the non-aggression pact was approved by the Soviet government, the very next day, September the 1st, 1939, the German Wehrmacht, or war machine, the German military, rolled into Poland, invading the country. And, the war was officially starting. Now it was turning into actual fighting because the Polish people and the Polish government did resist, and they did fight back, but it wasn't, they weren't able to do a whole lot because they still had a very small air force that was mostly old World War I era biplanes. A large percentage of their army was on horseback. And here come the Germans with tanks and modern airplanes. So the whole thing was over almost before it started. It was just a matter of days, really, less than a couple of weeks, when Poland fell. After that, the Soviets and the Germans essentially divided up Poland between themselves, and Germany took part, Russia took part, and there, bang, Hitler has some more Lebensraum. However, this was a step too far for the rest of the world, and Britain and France did declare war on Germany. So now the fighting has begun. Although that's a little misleading, because as we're going to see in the coming mini lectures, there was already fighting going on. It just wasn't in Europe. It was in the Eastern Hemisphere, but most, Europe's in the Eastern Hemisphere. It was in Asia. And most of the European and American world weren't paying too much attention to that, but they should have been. Anyway, this other term here, blitzkrieg, that means literally lightning war. And that was the German tactic, to come in like lightning super fast and roll over their opponents before essentially they even knew what was happening. And that's the tactic they would use in other countries as well to come. So now the fighting is officially on. September 1st, September 1st, 1939, usually given as the beginning of World War II. And that brings us up to what was happening in Europe up until the beginning of the war. However, as I just alluded to, there were already things going on in Asia, and Japan was right in the middle of them. So next, we will take a look at what's going on in Japan.